Hi, Oregon. I truly wish I was there in person. Bend, Oregon was one of the last trips that I was supposed to go on in the spring before all of the lockdown orders happened, and I was truly disappointed. I am from Washington State originally and used to vacation in Bend when I was a kid, actually. So I really was looking forward to going back and visiting the area and seeing the beautiful people and seeing you guys in person. So we will do this virtually in this virtual world where we are doing everything now from Thanksgiving to birthday parties and to make it work. So I think that America is truly in a pressure cooker situation. We are all living our lives in this virtual world, but we also are trying to homeschool kids and work virtually. We're trying to get as many hours as we can if we're working in person as an essential worker and stay healthy. And our lives have truly been uprooted and changed as we often have now senior adults living with us who were not expected to, or we have adult children who are now living with us at home as well. As we are all in this pressure cooker, what has happened is that America is truly looking for a different place to live, four different walls, whether that means a vacation home or whether that means remodeling a primary residence or just moving into a different place. As we have seen this pressure cooker situation continue, what we have seen is that home sales have skyrocketed. We truly have never seen this level of sales activity in 14 years. It has the highest annualized sales truly since 2006 when we look at the data. Not only has real estate rebounded from a V-shaped recovery, it has gone well past that. We have more than 100 months of year-over-year home price growth, which is the longest period of time that we have ever recorded in our data set, and we've tracked it back to the 1960s. It really is an unprecedented time. When we look at the MSAs that we track, the metropolitan statistical areas, what we see is that 181 of them, all of them that we track, have year-over-year home price growth. A truly unprecedented time. And that is new data that we just released last quarter. The time on market is at record lows, and truly this is because of the lack of inventory that is there with the buyers that are overwhelming the market. We are seeing down into the teens when we're tracking it on a weekly basis from list time to contract time. Honestly, we have never seen this before. And it's not just in metro areas. It's not the big metro areas like San Francisco and Seattle, Boston, New York. It's now tracking into rural areas, into small towns, because people are really looking for more space within their home and they're looking for a less dense area so that they can really enjoy walking on their block without having to run into a dozen people trying to do the same thing. So we are seeing that truly people are having a lot of demand in these types of secondary markets that we wouldn't have expected. The other thing that is very unique right now is that 60% of members, 3 in 5 members, are actually saying the market is hotter than normal this time of year. When we're thinking about approaching Thanksgiving, we're thinking about after Labor Day, after Halloween, looking at the holidays, this is not the time when we would traditionally see this many buyers flocking to the market, so many people in the pipeline, really having a multiple bid contract situation on many homes as people really do vie to find that perfect home for them. I have to credit the real estate industry. Back in March, we started doing a flash survey on a weekly basis, and we asked members, what are you guys doing to actually change your practice? And what we found very, very quickly within like the second or third iteration is that there was a very fast adoption of wearing masks, wearing them appropriately in homes, making sure that there is airflow within the home, keeping the windows and doors open, wearing shoe coverings, having gloves actually at the doorstep of people's homes to make sure that everyone could be actually safe in the real estate transaction. What we found very quickly from consumers is that with this very fast adoption of safe practices, much quicker than what we saw on a state, local, or national level, what we saw is that consumers felt absolutely safe going into homes that were listed for sale. This is consumer data that we have been tracking throughout the pandemic. And what we found is that people said, yes, I do feel safe actually going through a home that's listed for tour. Now, we've actually collected this information with a number of other industries, and what we found is that in comparison to going to the grocery store, going to a movie theater, a sporting event, people don't necessarily feel as safe even going to the grocery store as they do going through a home sale listing, home sale that's listed for a listing, oh my goodness, for a listing presentation. What we have found is that people feel safe doing that activity. And the reason why is because they're the only person in that home at once. And because of these quick adoptions of safety practices that were taken. The other thing that we're finding from this consumer data is there is a lot of demand to really look at a different type of four walls than you have been looking at. We started collecting information on remodeling in this as well. And what we found is that people have really cut back their spending on entertainment. They've cut back their spending on going out to restaurants or to movies because those are not necessarily as safe as other practices that they could be doing. And as different local areas have their stay-at-home pause actually taken, what we have found is that people can actually save quite a bit of money. And through that, and looking at their four walls, they're actually saying, can I actually remodel my home now? The follow-up to that is we wanted to understand, are people remodeling so that they can love their home and live there longer? Or are they remodeling their home so that they can actually list it for sale? And that's what we need to happen because the inventory is so tight. What we have seen is that people are actually considering, about a third of them actually listing their home for the sale in the future. And that is a really important consumer data point, as we know that the inventory is tight. And we also know the housing stock that's out there is pretty old, and it probably does need to be fixed up to be listed on the market for sale. We also know from member data that about half of members are actually working with potential sellers right now to make sure that those homes are ready for the market when they do feel like this is a safe time to actually list their home, and they feel like they can actually find that perfect home, that perfect neighborhood for them. The other thing that we're collecting data on is we're understanding vacation home markets in a different type of way. The demand is there, and it's not just seasonally based anymore. We used to see that some markets were only popular during certain types of year. So thinking about beach communities and only being popular during the summer months, perhaps Cannon Beach, Oregon, beautiful place to go, but probably not as popular when we think about the cold winter months. But now we're starting to see that these types of second markets are actually popular year round, and the home sales activity is continuing to go up. You're probably seeing that demand in Bend, Oregon, where it traditionally has only been popular at certain times of year. You're probably seeing that year round interest now as people are saying, you know, this is a great area to hike. This is a great area that I can enjoy during the winter months and the summer months, as people really do start to embrace this. It really has been popular to really look at these second homes, but it's not just for people to only spend perhaps a week or two there. We're also seeing that people are actually spending months in these second homes now, as they can, as school kids are going to school online, and as they can work from home. We're starting to see really embracing these second homes almost as a primary residence for the certain amount of time that they're spending there. The other big thing that we wanted to know is we wanted to understand, why are people relocating more than 50 miles? If you're looking for a second residence, if you're looking for a new primary residence, why are you looking for a longer area away? And the big question here is that traditionally what we've always seen is that people actually move primary residences about 10 miles, 10 to 12. So really not that far. A slightly better neighborhood, perhaps a slightly different school district, but not necessarily that far away from their primary residence. So what we're seeing now is that people are actually interested in moving a longer distance away, either a primary or a secondary home. What are they actually looking for, and why do they need that? Obviously, enjoying better weather is something that I think we all want right now, especially as we're spending so much time outside, especially as we're hitting the cold winter months. Starting to think about that, obviously top of the list. But right up there, and what has been consistently up there in these waves of consumer research, is that people really want to lessen their risk of COVID. So thinking about living in a less dense neighborhood, obviously top of the list if they can do it. The other thing that we're seeing here, and it's been very consistent in the data, and we started asking this in this particular way back in late June, early July. And what we saw is that people want to avoid social unrest. If there are protests that are happening in their neighborhoods, in their city centers, they just don't necessarily feel comfortable, and they're actually willing to move to avoid them. The other thing that we're seeing here is, and we'll skip to the red bar here, that 21%, thinking about maybe there's not protests in their neighborhood, maybe they're not necessarily seeing this, but the other thing that really, when we think about the election and the heightened just divisiveness that we have in so many communities, is that people want to live in an area where their political views are similar to the neighbors. Especially if you're thinking about a condo community, a townhouse community, where essentially you have a shared backyard, you want to feel comfortable sharing these political views and having conversations over the dinner table if you can outside. And you can't necessarily do that in some areas if the political views that you have don't necessarily line up with the neighbors. So we have seen that this was really actually causing people to move and consider different areas. I think this is a fascinating trend, something that we really had no reason to be asking before this. So I don't have trendline data on this, but I can tell you that during the pandemic, during this time period, it's been very, very consistent in the data. So I want to jump into some of that and kind of talk about how these protests really do relate to housing. And there is a connection here. And I think it's important to really examine this on a deeper level and understand some of the underlying data on this. So when we look at the homeownership rates in America, it truly is divided. We know that there's already a K-shaped recovery. And so if you haven't heard that term, the K-shaped recovery is essentially, we had that deep V down, but we've had some Americans who have been able to recover in this market, and then some Americans who really haven't been able to recover. And I think that we can all say that we've seen the news clips and we've seen the long lines at food banks in many areas as people who have jobs in sectors through no fault of their own have lost their jobs in this recession and in this downturn. But for many Americans, it really has been a recovery where they've been able to essentially not feel this and maybe even save money and think about these second homes or think about remodeling, because they've been able to quickly transition to working at home and just bringing their laptop home and having their kids homeschool at home. Much different recovery for many Americans, many of them recovering in July and June and feeling like everything is financially okay. And then many Americans really feeling that this could be a very, very difficult holiday season for their families. When we look at the homeownership rate overall, I want to show you some pretty depressing data. And you may have seen this before. This is the latest data that we have on an annualized basis from census. When we look at the recovery, we know that so many Americans have been left behind, but we also know that a lot of Americans that have been left behind are Black Americans and not are Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans. The non-Hispanic white homeownership rate is actually at 73% in comparison to the Black homeownership rate, which is at 42%. And that gap is massive. That gap is actually wider than it was in 1968 when it was actually legal to discriminate based on race and housing. It has widened over time. And there's a number of reasons behind that. I'm not going to go into all of the reasons behind that, but I will tell you that this is a snapshot from 1994 into 2019. And what we can see here is that the homeownership rate for Black and Hispanic Latino Americans was actually artificially pushed up during the boom years. Many of these Americans were actually targeted for faulty loan products through zero interest loans, through no doc loans with balloon payments at the end. And what happened is that these Americans actually lost their homes at double the rate of white Americans during the bust years. And so that helped to widen that homeownership rate gap. And one of the many ways that first-time homebuyers do enter into that buying process is really through family wealth and through a cyclical process of really helping other family members into homeownership. And so as we see that this gap has widened over time, it really does translate into future generations of Americans being left out of homeownership. The thing that's really important here is that home is really important to all of us right now as we think about just how much time we've spent here, nearly 24/7 at this point, but it's also the number one way that Americans do build wealth. And so I'll show you some data on that. But I want to show you one of the data points that we got back from our new profile of home buyers and sellers. Now, this is an annual report that we release on a yearly basis, and it was just released. This report is free, and I'm going to dive into some of the new data that we do have on it. But one of the data points that we collect on this is that home buyers who successfully purchased a home, we actually see that the rejection rate for mortgage applications is 10% for African Americans in comparison to just 4% for white Caucasians. And again, there are many reasons that feed into this gap of homeownership rates, but this is one of the reasons. We actually see that even for buyers who were able to enter homeownership, the denial rate is significantly higher for Black African Americans than it is for white Americans. We know through academic research that the application process is actually often a blind process through big data. And so people don't necessarily even know the race of people who are entering that, but we do see the denial rate is significantly higher. When the academic literature that's out there actually controls for things like income and debt to income ratio, we still see that African American denial rate continues to be persistently higher than the white Caucasian denial rate. Again, there are many reasons that feed into that gap, but this is just one of them. When we look at the end result here, what we see is that the family net worth for white non-Hispanic Americans is nearly $190,000 in comparison to Black African Americans, where it is just $24,000. That gap is, a lot of it can be attributed to housing wealth. When we see that gap, what we can see is the equity gains that white non-Hispanic Americans have through homeownership that Black African Americans and Hispanic Americans are really being left out of. And we can see that that gap actually has widened over time as well. And so when we talk about this K-shaped recovery, these things are persistent through the economy. Not only is it a homeownership gap, and not only is it a job gap and an essential worker who may not have employment right now, but we truly do see that this gap has widened in the family net worth over time as well. So looking at these factors, we can see as just some of the many, many factors that are contributing to the protests. But I do think it's important to understand the link that is going on in the Americans who have unfortunately not been able to be participants in the economy as some Americans have. All right, so let's move on. We have been collecting consumer data through the profile of home buyers and sellers since 1981. It is in a very long period of time. This is the 39th year that we have been doing this report. It was just released, and I have to say this is my favorite report that we do through the National Association of REALTORS. It is incredible because what we can do is we can look at home buyers and home sellers who had a transaction last year and really understand who they are and understand how these demographics are changing and what they want in their home and what they want from their real estate agent. When we look at this data, what we have seen this year is that the trends are changing and the pandemic really has changed buyer behavior. Some of the quick notes here that we are seeing is that the expected tenure in home is just 10 years for those who purchased during the pandemic versus 15 years for those who purchased pre-pandemic. 15 years is an incredibly long period of time, but we have seen that those who are purchasing during the pandemic are really just saying, I need to find a home right now. This may not be my forever home, but this is a home that's going to suit my family's needs at this exact moment. The other thing that we're seeing is that people are feeling comfortable using virtual tours, using these virtual tools that are out there and actually purchasing their home sight unseen. This is an incredible figure. We had no reason to ask this pre-pandemic, but what we have seen is that about 1 in 20 buyers actually purchase that home sight unseen compared to just 3% pre-pandemic. Really a very interesting number to look at this year in these very unique times. We also know that these buyers, again, have higher incomes, they have higher price points, they are those who are able to participate in this economy versus those who may not be able to. We know that COVID was bringing them delays in the process, whether that means that they needed to have wet signatures and they couldn't actually do that, whether that means that they had to time when they could actually physically go into a home to see it because that there were days or perhaps cleanings that happened between listing presentations. We know that people did have delays in the process. But buyers right now who are purchasing during the pandemic are seeing fewer homes. Now, part of this has to do with the lack of inventory that's out there, especially at these buyers' price points, but many of them are just choosing to only see homes online, being very strategic about the homes that they're seeing, especially if they're moving longer distances away. Some of the other things that are happening right now really have to do with the change in demographics that we're seeing in buyers. For 52% of 19 to 29-year-olds, 52%, they are actually living at home with family members. This is the largest share that we've actually seen since the Great Depression. It's an incredibly large share of 19 to 29-year-olds living at home. Truly, this is an unprecedented time in America, and there are lots of reasons why these young adults are living at home. Some of this has to do with college going online or a hybrid environment, and so they're just living at home. Some of it has to do with these young adults actually choosing a gap year in college or just skipping college altogether this year. And then also it has to do with a lot of young professionals, even if they're married, going home to live with their parents or in-laws because they have a fully stocked fridge and pantry and choosing not to live in their high cost apartment building downtown. As we see this happening, what we know is that there's a lot of people who actually needed to buy a multi-generational home this year. In the past, we've collected data on multi-generational buying, and we've seen that it's bounced around 11%, 12% on an annual basis. Pre-pandemic, 11% of buyers this year did purchase a multi-generational home. When we look at during the pandemic, 15% of people purchased a multi-generational home. That's a very big jump in just a few months. Now, some of this is because these unprecedented share of young adults are living at home. But the other thing that we see is that people are pooling money to buy a larger home in a different location. Perhaps they can all quarantine together and they feel better about doing that, especially as school children have gone to school online. Perhaps you can have other adults living with them who can actually care for these kids. The other big thing that we're seeing and is most popular for these multi-generational buyers and most common is that aging relatives who perhaps were living independently are now moving back in or never have perhaps lived there with these adult parents and are living with them now. This becomes a very interesting situation as perhaps the housing stock that we have in America really does not accommodate these adults. If they were living in a senior care situation, a senior center, they probably are really living in a home that does not accommodate their needs right now. So a lot of the remodeling that is going on probably is going to be looking at this guardrails, thinking about wider hallways, wider doors that will actually fit a walker through. Things like this that these homes probably don't have are probably going to be needs for these individuals later on in the future if they continue living with their adult children. One of the other big trends that we have seen is that we really have a baby bust situation in this country. We have more than a 35-year low in birth rates. People are not having children like they had in the past because it is just too expensive. For many areas of the country, when we think about the daycare costs, it is $2,000 a month for one child in daycare. Very, very expensive to be able to add a child onto a family and to think about even having two children in that situation. So for many families, we have really seen this baby bust situation happen. And when we look at home buyers today, what we actually see is that it really mirrors this baby bust. When we look back at 1985, 58% of home buyers did have a child under the age of 18 in their home. And today, just 33% of home buyers have a child under the age of 18. That is a tremendous change over that time period. There are some huge implications here for not only what people need in their home, but also the amount of space that they have and the location of their home. How important does the school district play if a family doesn't have a child and if there is no intention of having a child in that home? There's been a lot of talk about having this baby boom with the pandemic and that we're going to have a lot of little girls named Pandemica in 5 years. I'm not sure that I buy it. I think that a lot of young adults have unfortunately lost their jobs and they would not necessarily be in a situation where they would be saying, let's have a baby right now. I could be proven wrong. I guess we'll have to see. Time will tell on that one, but I don't necessarily know that we're going to have this big baby boom coming out of this pandemic. I will say one boom that absolutely has happened is that we have had a clearing of the shelters in this country. There have been a lot of animal adoptions. There's actually been secondary industries that have been started where you can adopt a pet across the country. You may physically not want to fly in a plane right now, but someone will transfer that pet to you. And there has been an industry that has been started just for really moving pets for adoption or for sale across the country so that families can have a new fur baby. These are all the pets who live in my house because I'm completely insane. I have 4 cats and a dog here, and they are crazy at all times. But truly, this is something that is influencing where people buy and what they need out of their homes. For unmarried couples, for single females, it's actually more important to them to have either a home or a location that accommodates their pets. So whether they have a fenced yard or walking trails to go on with their dog, than it actually is to be close to good schools. It is absolutely a priority for these types of buyers who have pets and are animal lovers that their home really does accommodate their pets. We are seeing also a change in who the first-time home buyers are. So when we look at first-time home buyers today, what we have seen is really a change over time here. We have seen this drop in marriage rates across the country. When we look back at the 1960s, more than 70% of American adults were married, and today just half of American adults are married. So when we look at the profile of what a first-time home buyer looks like, what we see is that back in the 1980s, 75% of first-time homebuyers were married couples compared to just 52% today. So again, mirroring that drop in marriage rates across the country. What we have seen over the time period is that, yes, we did have a bump up of single female buyers. It's actually trailed off with affordability constraints and inventory constraints, but we've actually seen a slight rebound in that. Not where we have seen it at the height, but we are seeing a rebound at 19%. We're also seeing this small rise in single male buyers, and we're seeing this really unprecedented rise in unmarried couples who are purchasing the largest financial investment of their life with someone they're not married to. It's a very interesting trend. The other thing that we are seeing here is in the yellow line, we're actually seeing a rise in over time. We did see a small drop off this year, but we saw a big rise during the pandemic of both unmarried couples, but also roommates purchasing homes together. Especially during the pandemic, I think there's a lot of people who are perhaps renting in expensive city centers, now can work remote and are saying, let's move to a suburban area. Let's move outside of the city center to where it's really expensive, move perhaps even to a small town and purchase a home together with these unprecedented low interest rates. It's a very interesting time seeing this change in demographics of these home buyers. The other big thing to note here, though, is that the first-time home buyers have actually dropped to a 33-year low. It is a very small share of first-time home buyers in comparison to what we have seen historically. Historically, we'd like this number to be close to 40% for primary residence buyers, and we have seen it drop off. It is very hard for first-time home buyers to be able to save for a down payment right now, especially when we think about the hurdles of inventory and affordability. One of the other things that has happened here in the last 2 years is we've actually seen the age of first-time home buyers rise to 33. So that's the highest that we've seen their age, their median age. It has traditionally ranged between 28, 32, and not risen this high. In the last year, we also saw that first-time homebuyers are less likely to be able to rely on family help. I think part of that has to do with the pandemic. We have seen, however, that age really being a contributing factor there as well, because as you get to 33 years old, it's probably less likely you're going to be living in your family member's home, moving directly into homeownership, which we do see for younger home buyers. The other change is relying on mom and dad's help. The big thing that we saw last year is a third of first-time home buyers actually had down payment assistance from friends or family. So whether that's a gift or a loan to really push them into homeownership. This year, we saw that drop to a quarter of first-time home buyers. So that's a really significant drop, and that's probably something that is contributing to that drop in first-time home buyers. Now that 50% mark there on that chart, that was the first-time homebuyer tax credit during 2008 and 2010. We saw a lot of first-time homebuyers being pushed into the market. We probably saw an effect for the next couple of years as first-time homebuyers dropped off. But at this point, we're probably not seeing any impact of that at this point. Really, this is a new crop of first-time homebuyers, and they really have dropped to this all-time low that we haven't seen in 33 years. So I mentioned student loan debt being one of these huge hurdles into homeownership, especially for first-time homebuyers. We actually see the median student loan debt amount for first-time homebuyers and homebuyers overall is actually $30,000 if they have it. That's pretty significant, and that's definitely going to cut into the price of home that people are able to purchase, probably impacts the location of where they're able to purchase, and probably impacts whether they're purchasing solo or whether they're purchasing as an unmarried couple or with a roommate. One of the big things that did happen with the stimulus packages with the pandemic is that student loan debt actually went to a 0% interest rate. That is a huge leg up for someone who has student loan debt. What we saw pre-pandemic, before the stimulus package, is that for 47% of student loan debt holders, they actually were in a negative amortization loan. They made good on-time payments, they made sure to make these payments, but the next quarter they looked at their student loan balance and they actually owed more on their student loan debt than they did before they made the payments. Really a pretty discouraging factor when we do look at these student loan debt payments. So having the 0% interest rate could really be a big leg up if we see that people can really tackle this debt, especially if they're living at home with their parents and gainfully employed. This could be a huge benefit. The other thing that happened with student loan debt, though, is that it automatically went into forbearance if they're on federal student loans until the end of the year. That is a mixed bag. If you don't realize and your account is being auto-debited and you're not aware of this, you're just not making payments right now. Now, it's not going to hurt your credit, but you're not making payments. So this is something where if you do need to be making payments on other loans, obviously you can be making them, but this is definitely something where people should be checking their balances and making sure that if they want to tackle their debt and their principal of their debt, they can be doing that as well. So I talked a lot about buyers. I want to talk about some of the seller trends that we saw in the report and some of the big changes that we saw. I talked a little bit about urgency, but we are seeing that sellers are absolutely urgently wanting to sell and just find a home that better fits their family needs. And really, they need a bigger home. That's the number one factors that sellers who are selling during the pandemic are really wanting is they want a bigger home. And in comparison, what we saw pre-pandemic is people just want to move close to their friends and family. It's not necessarily a life change or a job change. It's just wanting to be close to their friends and family. And that's a pretty interesting dynamic there and a very quick change that we saw. The other thing that we're seeing is that sellers who are selling during the pandemic, they're more willing to offer incentives, especially when it comes to remodeling or to home warranties. Again, the housing stock is older. People have been in their home for an extensive period of time. Tenure has reached all-time highs. So there probably are things that they need to fix, and they probably don't want to wait around to find a contractor to come into their home and really fix these things. It's very difficult to find a good contractor and very difficult to be able to bring someone into your home and actually get these things fixed. So they're probably just willing to say, here, you can take care of this and really customize that to the buyer's needs. The other thing that we did see, however, is that people are willing to make price concessions. Now, it is absolutely a seller's market. It is very quick time from list time to contract time right now, really an unprecedented short period of time. But during, at least early in the pandemic, we did see that sellers were willing to make price concessions, but they were selling at a higher price point. They were well-off buyers and sellers in this time period. And so they were probably able to make these concessions, probably able to actually give these incentives on their home. And they had more equity that they did walk away with. Also, virtual tours, no surprise, people are really using this technology. They're using it in their search process. They're buying these homes, placing contracts on them sight unseen. And so sellers are offering these virtual tours, these virtual listings, even virtual open houses to make sure that people can actually see this home without physically going into the home. All right, so I'm going to shift gears here and talk about the agent use. We are seeing this be near all-time highs, that 88% of buyers are using agents during that process. Even if people are buying new built homes, new construction, they actually do want agent representation. So we're just seeing those ideas of agent representation really being at highs, even if people are buying new homes. When we look at the selling side, what we see is that 89% of sellers did use an agent during the process, and they want a full service agent. We've actually collected data back more than a decade on the type of agent that's out there, whether it's a limited service agent, someone who just lists on the MLS, provides some services, but not all. But what we find is that people really do want someone who's going to who's going to market the home, price the home, walk the seller through that process, find out ways to fix the home for sale. Again, that older housing stock, knowing that those homes need some work, and people really do want this representation on their side. FSBO's near all-time lows at just 8%. We've seen it tracking around 7-8% for several years now, really not having much movement here, as people don't feel comfortable doing this by themselves. They don't know how to price their home, and they don't know all the steps in the process, and they know it's hard to do. We did actually look at iBuyers this year. There's been a lot of fodder, a lot of talk, at least about a year ago, about the trend of iBuyers. We really did not see enough data in this data set. We did report it, but it was less than 1% of actually sellers who are using an iBuyer service to actually sell their home. People not really embracing this, especially likely after they find how much they would actually sell their home for, which is significantly different, 14 to 16% price difference, according to some academics who are out there putting research out on this. So we did collect some consumer research on this, and we wanted to understand just how is that relationship different with your agent right now during the pandemic. And we did see that people really want the agent on their side. And it's actually more important during the pandemic than it actually was before the pandemic. People really relying on that agent to have the honesty, to have the good reputation, to be trustworthy, and really bring them through this process that is just full of anxiety in this environment that's full of anxiety right now. All right, so I'm gonna end on a bunch of question marks, in all honesty. I don't necessarily know what's next as we enter just truly this unprecedented time, and just looking at what's out there in the home buying market. I think there's a bunch of question marks right now, and a lot of them have been answered in recent months, but I think we still have some. Yes, people want bigger homes. They want one home office, maybe two home offices, maybe three for homeschooling kids. But what we also know is there's a lot of people who are used to living in very small condos, very small apartments in city centers, and they just want land around them. And what we could see is really people embracing tiny homes on land, just having the physical space to be able to walk around. We also know that vacation homes really are growing right now. We see a lot of people embracing the idea of vacation homes as they can't take vacations themselves, can't jump on a flight, and their entertainment spending has gone down. And if these vacation homes do have good broadband, what's keeping them from becoming the primary residence, and perhaps their city home becomes their secondary residence? This absolutely is a huge question mark as we think about the next few months, 6 months, year down the road. I think that this is a big question mark for families. The other thing that we are starting to see trends on too is that people who have retirement that's 10, 15 years down the road, with these low interest rates, they are making early retirement purchases, really thinking about, this could be my vacation home now, but that's my retirement home in the future. And people are really embracing that trend. The other thing is that as these things are happening, and if they become overwhelmingly happening, I think we really could see a reinvention of rural areas, traditional recreation areas, as consumers look at, what are the commercial properties that I want here? What are the types of coffee that I want to grab in the morning, or the bagel that I want to have? And where I used to be able to hop down to the local coffee shop in my urban area, maybe I want to be able to do that in these rural areas. I think that's a big question mark. Obviously, broadband being that huge reinvention too, as we think of just the priority of broadband access and good broadband access. And then the big question mark for so many families is, how does school come into play? Back in September, more than 70% of school kids went to school online. They started their school year online, probably in their PJ pants. not necessarily in a physical school building. And then many schools opened up, and now we're back to a pause situation, a temporary situation where many of us are at home. So, how does this all play a big factor here? And then, are we going to see a big drop in tenure? We have seen that tenure has risen to these all time highs of 10 years in home. It used to be 6 or 7 that people would move when they had a new job or a life change happened. A new baby, a marriage, a divorce. What we did see is that tenure rose because these life changes weren't happening. We saw the drop in birth rates, we saw the drop in marriage rates. And so you didn't necessarily have this impetus to move. But we also know a lot of people were underwater in their home coming out of the Great Recession. Now they have equity. Home prices have gone up and they may be able to sell where in the past they hadn't. So we could see this drop in tenure as we move forward. I went over a lot of national data. I want to make sure that I tell you about this local website where you can play around with, grab local data, grab state data. It is interactive. You can actually download PDFs, but play around with the clickable map as well. And then the last thing I want to make sure to do is tell you guys to follow us on social media. But the profile of home buyers and sellers, traditionally, we do charge for this report. It is free this year. If you are a realtor, it is free under Right Tools right now. You can grab this report from our realtor store and just log in and download it as well. So thank you guys so much for having me virtually. I'm psyched to be with you, but I truly, I do wish I was there in person because that would be a better experience, I think, for all of us. So thank you guys so much for having me.
We have loads of questions for you this morning. I know it's a little later over on the East Coast, but it's a beautiful day here in Bend, Oregon. If you ever make it out this way, a little dusting of snow and the sun's out, it's quite lovely. But welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Dr. Lautz, we have several questions here in about 20 minutes. So I'm just going to use my iPad and go through these questions that we're getting via feed through our platform that we've been using here this morning. So I'm going to kick it off with a question about really what changes are more permanent than temporary in your opinion. So buyers' preferences are changing, as you pointed out so well in your presentation, as a result of this pandemic. But do you think some of these changes are going to be staying with us post-COVID? And how do you see that playing out in the market?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a big change that could be permanent is multi-generational homes. We've seen that minorities are more likely to purchase multi-generational homes, and there's a growth in minorities in the country. So I think both of those things really go hand in hand. But I also think that family, the importance of family, people taking care of each other, that's not going to go away. And so, if people are financially reliant on each other during COVID, during the downturn, they're going to continue that reliance, I think, into the future. Now, the young adult aspect, I don't know. I think there is a certain point of those young adults, they may need to leave the nest for everyone's well being. But I do think at least older adults living at home, I think that that could be an ongoing trend. Things that I hope do not continue is I do hope that one day we do see an uptick in first time homebuyers. I hope that they regain footing back into the market. We just have not seen them in recent years.
Yes, and that's certainly true here in Central Oregon. And I remember the graph that you brought up that the first-time homeowners peaked several years ago, right after the recession, and I think directly related to affordability, one would think. And this is something that's really concerning here in Central Oregon. As a Bend Chamber of Commerce, my board, and I know all our members are really worried about people being able to afford to actually live here. We need the talent in the workforce, and we need them to be able to find a place to live and to be comfortable and enjoy the fabulous things about Bend. But it's not so fabulous if you can't find a place to lay your head at night. So the next question is affordability to that very issue. It's, as I said, a big issue here in Central Oregon, and for a number of factors. So we have a new administration coming into the White House. We have the backside, hopefully, of a pandemic next year. So when you're looking at that first year, is there anything the federal government can do to address inventory nationwide Or is there too much variation in land use laws, zoning? Do you see something that could be applied ubiquitously?
Yeah, that is a huge question. Um, Affordability is a massive issue and it's a nationwide issue. It is something that is really local, though, when we think about the local approaches, when we think about impact fees or looking at land use and density restrictions. Those are really local issues that we understand we need a national initiative to build more homes, but every approach is going to be different on a local scale. If we think about Buffalo, New York, they have inventory, but that type of inventory that they have, it needs to be remodeled. It is not a livable condition. But then if we think about LA, we know that their issues with not building are really density restrictions and the number of stories that can be built on a home. And so those issues are different as well. I think as we look coming out of the pandemic, there's been a lot of state and local areas that have been really hard hit financially. And so, one of the aspects that's happening is that there's fodder, at least, and I don't know if we're seeing it in practice, about the impact fees going up in homes and new building. And if that happens, that's going to further restrict really that lack of new build, that lack of inventory that we're missing right now. So I hope that's not the approach that's going to be taken in Central Oregon, but that's certainly one of the approach that state and local governments do have to make.
Yes, I agree. Along those lines of questioning, so if you're familiar with the state of Oregon land use laws specifically, they're pretty stringent. Urban growth boundaries are how we grow, and it's very incremental, and there are a lot of criteria you have to make in order to stretch your UGB further out. Density is one of those criteria. So when you're looking at that, and Oregon's situation, we've all been looking at how to densify ourselves. But do you suggest any other ways, or maybe that is the answer that you've seen in your research of how communities can plan better for affordable and equitable housing and meet the demand for space that we're seeing not only during pandemic but afterwards? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that really needs to happen as we look at these restrictions are, do these restrictions meet the demographics of the area? So if we think about Minneapolis as a good example, and I think there's a lot of people who are using them as examples where they have single family homes that are very large, that they actually have allowed them to break them into multifamily units, 4 units for the zoning that once was for a single family home. If we think about the drop in birth rates, we think about the drop in marriage rates, the growth of single adults. Are the homes that are being built, do they accommodate a single adult or do they accommodate two parents, two children, and maybe even an added guest room? And so I think when we look at those types of factors, we need to think about what's the demographics of the actual area. And that's going to be very particular to that area. The other thing that we need to think about too is some areas have parking restrictions and they really need to be zoned for 2 cars. But if there's one adult living there, they probably don't have 2 cars. So just thinking about little factors like that, or do they even rely on vehicle transportation? Or are they relying on public transportation more in those areas? So those I think are some of the things that are approaches. The other one is EDUs, thinking about accessory dwelling units. If we have this growth in multi-generational families, allowing accessory dwelling units can be a really big opportunity for families to really not have to necessarily move, to expand the number of people who are living there in almost a universal design way, so that you could have a young adult, you could have an aging relative. It could be an office space or an Airbnb space too. So thinking about those types of next steps and what does the future look like?
That's really interesting that there's so much that you're saying that we've been seeing here in Central Oregon. And if you would have talked about this 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of these ideas weren't fully on the table as they are today. I want to talk now a little bit more about who is buying homes. Again, really great data. Thank you for sharing everything that you did. So when you look at the data for home buyers, what data point in the 2020 profile of home buyers and sellers most surprised you?
Um, I think the one that was most surprising to me is seeing that 5% of consumers, of buyers, actually purchase their home sight unseen. That one jumped out at me. And we had no reason to report this data point in past years. It was only 3% last year, and it's 3% pre COVID. 5% doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're thinking about 1 in 20 people who just bought a home are doing so without physically seeing the home before they move in or close on that transaction, hopefully they're seeing it during that home inspection process or something along those lines. But that's a pretty big leap of faith in your realtor, in that community, that that's where you want to be, and that that home is the right home for you. So I think that one really does shock me because it is the biggest financial transaction you have in your lifetime.
Yeah, we're seeing that trend here too. I've heard stories from a lot of our realtors about a lot of sight unseen, get your bid in first kind of action happening from out of state buyers in particular. Okay, so when you think about those buyers and look at the data in this environment here in Central Oregon, we're seeing an influx of cash buyers and things like escalation clauses. Is this a trend you're seeing in other markets and MSAs around the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So this morning we just released our newest existing home sales data, but one of the reports that we release in conjunction with that is our Realtors Confidence Index. That gives us a really good opportunity to actually talk to realtor members, see what's going on in their communities, but see this on a nationwide scale. So a lot of the data is actually mapped on a local level. When we look at it on a nationwide scale, what we're seeing is that for every home that's listed, there's 4 bids for that home. That's a lot. And that's a lot of escalation clauses. That's a lot of, well, let's skip some sort of contingency here. Let's just go forward with the purchase. So we're certainly seeing that. And we did see that investors too, they're still in the market, which I think is interesting. If we had fewer investors, perhaps we'd have more inventory for those first time home buyers out there, that entry level buyer who wants to enter. But those investors are still persistently in the market right now.
Right. So let's talk a little bit. So what we're talking about here is upper middle class buyers. And you spent a lot of time talking about the entry level affordability market as well. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about that. Have you seen any trends, any strategies around the country that is enabling minority and affordable home buyers, first-time home buyers, a better chance at actually getting into the market? Have you seen anything across the country that you think indicates might be a really good idea for us, for example, to employ?
So there's definitely those first-time homebuyer savings accounts that some states do have, and I'm not sure off the top of my head if Oregon is one of the places that does. At least from just kind of a behavioral approach, it is good when you think about, I'm going to slot this amount of money each month and it's going to go to my own savings account that can go to my first home. And so I think that that is a good approach. There's not a lot of data on whether this is an effective approach so far, because it is relatively new. So there's not a lot of academic literature that's out there saying this really does put first time home buyers into homes. But those accounts, I think, at least from a mental standpoint, when you look at your budget at the end of the month, where does each money go? Do I have a backup savings account? Well, is this my emergency fund? Is this my entertainment fund? And entertainment, of course, is a loose definition right now. But I think that it is a good approach for first time buyers, especially to have that savings account that is established for them.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So there are a couple of questions in the queue. Again, probably most related to those first-time home buyers, and that's students. And you talked quite a bit about student loan debt. And in the next administration, there's a possibility that there'll be some loan forgiveness. So when you think about what advice you would give to get those who are out of college paying off student debt, how do you see that trend affecting the ability of those who are just out of school or 10, 15 years out of school? How important is that to address the issue of student debt?
It's massive. Student loan debt is honestly one of the biggest hurdles that we have post the Great Recession, for home buyers to enter the buying market. And it's also a huge hurdle for repeat buyers to be able to actually upgrade into their next home. Um, I have to say too, and I know that I talk about a lot of young people having student loan debt, but it's not just a young person issue. For those who are over the age of 55, their student loan debt has increased more than 1,000% in the last decade. It is truly astronomical when we think about the student loan debt issue. It is the one debt that everyone said was a good debt, so it was okay to take on. But what happened is that a lot of people attempted going to school or they went to for profit institutions and they took on small amounts of debt, but they didn't necessarily obtain that degree. And so it was so hard for them to pay it off. If there is a forgiveness program, I'm not saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I will say that it probably will stimulate some portion of the economy with some spending. And that is definitely a huge leg up for those individuals who absolutely have not obtained that degree or having a hard time paying off that debt, could be in the service sector right now, lost their job. That could absolutely be a leg up for those individuals.
Yeah, I agree. Um, One of the I'm going to switch a little bit now to the other side of the spectrum because in Central Oregon and Bend, we experience a lot of second home buyers and investment buyers. What role do you see them playing on a national scale, and what you know of Oregon in influencing the market and what trends are going to come out of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the second home buyers, they're persistent. They're there in the market, and they've definitely increased during COVID. So as we think about staying at home, looking at those four walls, the interest for second home buyers, even if they truly are not investors or someone who is necessarily at that very high income, there's a lot of people who have this entertainment spending or this vacation spending that they're not spending on anymore, and they can start chalking away that and start thinking about purchasing a second home. I don't think that Central Oregon is one of these places, but in some areas of the country, you can honestly pick up a second home for under $100,000 if you're thinking about cabins on the lakes. I know that's probably laughable in your area, but we are seeing that there are some people who this would have been out of reach before, and they've been okay economically to be able to keep their jobs and keep that money. There is absolutely a strong interest. We used to actually do a vacation home report where we would separate out someone who's a vacation buyer from an investor. And it's pointless at this point because there's so many services like Airbnb and VRBO and HomeAway where people essentially they don't just consider it an investment property, they consider it a vacation home, an early retirement purchase. It's all overlapping.
Yeah, here in Bend, you're right. The average, the home house price of a home is, I think, north of $530,000 now. And boy, that's pretty new for us. It jumped, I think, something like 60, $70,000 in a little over a year. So when you look at all these investors and vacation houses and that sort of thing, it has its own unique impacts on the housing market. Because basically what you have is a lot of empty homes and a lot of people not being able to afford to live here. And it's been a source of it's confounded us. How do we address something of this nature? And we've tried not to be veil. And I've heard a lot of conversations about not being a resort community, but we kind of are. We've kind of arrived in part. We do have a pretty robust business ecosystem here. But when you look across the country at some of these resort communities, what strategies have you seen really be effective in figuring out how to build affordable housing, workforce housing?
Ooh, that is a huge question. So I I'm from Cleella, Washington originally, and that is I think almost a sister city to Bend, Oregon, because we have Suncadia, and I think I can't remember the name of the resort, but it's owned by the same folks who came into Bend, Oregon, 20 years ago, 30 years ago at this point. I'm not sure. And so I think even looking at my hometown of Cleella, home prices there used to be around 100,000 and now I think they've tripled over time as well as the resort came in. And that is a huge source of jobs and opportunities for people who didn't necessarily have them in the past, but that is a big affordability constraint for people who are trying to live there. As far as local strategies and building more homes, having those relationships with the home builders, encouraging them to build, but any restrictions that are there locally that hold back building, try and work on removing them. I don't have good strategies to tell you the truth because I do know it's such a local issue when we think about the problems that we have here.
Dang it. I was hoping you'd have the answer. Okay, final question of the morning, Dr. Lautz. What trends and key indicators will you be watching moving forward?
Yeah, the jobs numbers for sure. If rehiring is going to continue, um, the other the other thing I'll be watching, of course, is student loan debt. What does happen with that at the end of the year? I think that's a big question mark, especially when we know that so many Americans are in forbearance, so they don't have to make those payments. But if their payment comes due, that's going to be a problem for a lot of Americans. And so, looking what happens to there, and then also looking at, do multi-generational homes, do they continue? Is this going to be a factor that does continue into 2021 past COVID, past recessions? What's going to happen post the vaccine? So I think those are big question marks on my radar.
Dr. Lautz, I want to thank you so much on behalf of the Bend Chamber of Commerce and all of our members watching today for being with us and sharing such great, rich information. We truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.